1045 The Team, your home for New York sports. It's time to talk a little football, fantasy, and otherwise with our friend Field Yates. Brought to you by Mohawk Army Navy with the largest selection of boots in the capital region for over 32 years with stores in Niskayuna, Latham, and Saratoga. The news of the day, Joe Girardi out in New York. So, Field, I got to ask you, what are your thoughts on the Yankees getting rid of their manager after going to Game 7 of the ALCS?
You know, I kind of think there are two separate stories here for me. First of all, specific to Girardi, I understand he's a difficult person for some people to deal with, right? I mean, that's not a mystery. I think he would admit as much to anybody that asked him. However, at the same time, first of all, the numbers kind of speak for themselves right now with Girardi. They've won more games, I believe, in the ML than any other team in the MLB since he took over back in 2008. And I just wonder, like, across sports, is the standard for head coaches and GMs shrinking to a point that it's uncomfortable? Like, Earl Watson gets fired after 3 games as a Suns head coach this season. Like, why would the move be made after 3 games? Heck, it should have been maybe before the season. But, like, do they really expect Earl Watson to be the franchise savior? Then in Joe Girardi, like, he had steadied that ship, and it's never easy being the Yankees manager. It's not easy to be anything involved with the Yankees. That's part of being, one of the most iconic franchises in sports. So I just wonder if perhaps the standard for coaches these days has just gotten out of whack. GMs as well. We see Dave Gettleman and John Dorsey in the NFL get fired this summer, very surprisingly. Like, I think maybe perhaps we need to reset our standards as to what a successful manager or head coach or GM looks like.
And that segues perfectly into this. The New York Giants, earlier this week, their GM Jerry Reese comes out and says, "It's on me. I'm the reason why we're 1-6. Is Jerry Reese the biggest reason why the Giants are 1-6?
I don't think so, guys, because this is the same GM who got lauded last year for going big in free agency and signing a player like Olivier Vernon and re-signing JPP to what was a 1-year deal and then eventually turned into a contract extension this past offseason. And the same person who got kudos for trading up in the draft, something he doesn't normally do, to select Landon Collins, the second-round pick a couple of years ago or a few years back out of Alabama. So I think it's unfair to ever put team failures on a single person. I think Jerry Reese, though, probably did the only thing he could do on during that press conference, which is to go up there and basically take it on the chin and say, listen, I'm the one who is, taking the responsibility here, understanding that if you went up there and said, hey, the players got to play better and we got to coach more effectively, it would all come back to him as negative backlash. So I thought that it was smart of Jerry Reese to accept responsibility for a lot of the roster failures. Am I saying he's not at all responsible? Of course not. Of course he's the one that's responsible for a lot of the roster successes and failures as the person who signs off on all moves. But to make it solely about him, to me, which I don't think many people are doing, but to say it's just Jerry Reese, that also is unfair.
Field Yates with us right now, 1045 The Team, your home for Jets football. So, Field, since the motto of the day or the theme is guys losing or keeping their jobs, when you look at the Jets right now as they get ready to play the Falcons, who haven't beat anybody in the AFC East, have McCagnon and Bowles done enough that they should keep their jobs?
I'd say this is it's a very fluid process, obviously, when it comes to evaluating jobs, but I firmly believe that Todd Bowles has done one of the best coaching jobs of the NFL so far this season, right? Like, if I told you at this point, or if I told you on August 26th, 2 months ago today, that the Jets were going to be 1-6 at this point, you might say, yeah, I can buy it. That sounds about right for the Jets. If I told you 2-5, you would have said, yeah, that might be even optimistic. The fact that they're 3-4 and playing competitively, like they probably should be 4-3. That game in Miami last week gets away from them in the closing minutes. I think Todd Bowles has done a fantastic job. And, Mike McCagnon, I got to be honest, guys, the track record of drafting hasn't been superior so far, but this draft class makes me feel like he's got a chance to turn things around. Marcus May and Jamal Adams have had some rookie moments, but on the whole, I feel like they've been 2 very positive contributors, and that right there could set the tempo for each of these, for McCagnon keeping his job going forward.
Field, we've covered the other 2 New York teams. The Bills already have new people in place with McDermott and Bean. Are they going to beat the Raiders? Like, what is this Bills team and what is this Raiders team? Like, neither one of them. I have no handle on either team.
I would say that this Bills team is darn competitive. They play ridiculously hard, and there's a culture in place right now in Buffalo that is impossible to ignore. I mean, I think between what Sean McDermott, their head coach, has installed plus what some of these veterans on their roster have helped them do so far this season. Like, I'm so impressed by GM Brandon Beane and head coach Sean McDermott. They are so well disciplined, which, unfortunately was something that's gotten away from them over the past couple of years. They just were not a particularly disciplined football team. So the fact that they can go into any single week and at least have a chance, I don't think a lot of people were forecasting that from the Bills this offseason, especially when they traded away, for example, Sammy Watkins just before the season begins. So my hat goes off to the Bills and that regime. As for Oakland, guys, I don't want to say they were, an obvious regression candidate. But if you look back to some of last year's wins, even going back to week 1, they go for 2 in that game against New Orleans to win that game on the road. They've come back down to earth a little bit, and I think part of the reason is just players that we expected for them to be really good have not been particularly good this year. Now, Amari Cooper before last week was kind of the obvious answer to who has underperformed, but the offensive line, which is dominant last year, simply hasn't been dominant so far this season, or at least for much of it. But if they can turn that around, and they certainly have the ingredients to do so, then Oakland might have a chance to make a run in this AFC West, because any team in that division can beat any other team in that division on a given Sunday, which I'm not sure is something you say about most divisions around the NFL.
Phil, we're talking about those Raiders. Marshawn Lynch, he's suspended this week. He's running on the field, and then he's grabbing referees, supporting the other team. What do you make of him? Is he a bigger distraction than what he's worth on the field?
No, it's one of those where from the outside it probably looks that way, and I can understand that sentiment. There are times where I think to myself, is it worth whatever comes with Marshawn Lynch? At the same time, I feel like he's one of those players, and it's sort of hard to say unless you're sort of seeing it in front of you. But he feels like one of those guys that when he's on your team, you love him. When he's not on your team, it's harder to figure out what he brings to the squad. Because, guys, objectively speaking, he has not run particularly well this year, right? No. The team actually looked better running the football last week when DeAndre Washington took over as the primary back. So I understand why people are making that question or having that question about Marshawn Lynch. I also think, though, that he means a lot to that locker room, means a lot to that city right now, that Marshawn Lynch is not going anywhere, and he's probably going to be a big part of whether the Raiders succeed or not this season.
This week, next week, we get a little heavier with bye weeks when it comes to fantasy football. Your best strategy in handling a bye week?
The most important piece of advice that I can give is to not take care of your bye week on the week that you are, not account for players on a bye that week, right? It's so smart to get ahead of the game. So think about the teams that are on a bye next week. The Patriots are on a bye next week. The Vikings are on a bye next week. 2 of those teams, 2 of the 6 teams that, for example, you're going to have a lot of players to replace. Brady and Gronk and Brandon Cooks and Chris Hogan and also Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Kyle Rudolph, etc. So I would be thinking ahead now to the players that you might see that are available at this time that might not be available next week, because somebody else who might have the same gap they have to fill is going to say, all right, well, here are players who are available. I'll go snag them right now. So my best piece of advice is always to be thinking 1 week ahead.
Phil Yates with us, 104.5 The Team. Any players out there that are under the radar right now that you like?
Yeah, I know Matthew Berry has said this as much as well on our Fantasy Focus Football podcast, but somebody like Corey Davis is a good example. Then Adam Stash, Titans wide receiver, somebody who is drafted 5th overall, so he's got incumbent ability, he's got natural ability. Hasn't played a ton this year because of a hamstring injury, but seems to be getting closer to coming back. Same division, Marlon Mack, the Colts backup running back. Frank Gore is timeless, but if the team is totally out of the mix, you got to figure there's a chance they would say, all right, maybe it behooves us to play some of our younger guys. Marlon Mack will be an obvious example of that.
Phil Yates, he's our guy who helps us make sense of the fantasy world and the world on the field. We appreciate you, and you bring up the podcast. I don't know how you put up with Matthew Berry so well, but you do it better than most.
Hey, listen, we love working together, and it's a blessing every day. We have a ton of fun. It doesn't feel like work. That much I can say for sure.
Gotta love that, man. Thanks for the call, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, guys. Sounds good. Take care.